Since the violence began more than a week ago, the Justice Department has been tracking and arresting extremists the DOJ accuses of stoking violence at otherwise peaceful protests. And it's not just the far-left Antifa. Correspondent Leland Bittert is digging deeper into that story tonight, what we're finding out. Good evening, Leland.
Well, good evening to you, Shannon. How about that group called the Boogaloo? Well, Boogaloo can mean a lot of things. It can be used as a noun, an adjective, maybe even a verb to describe, among other things, people or events. And if there's a common thread among those who ascribe to this ideology, it's a belief that a second civil war is coming. Ryan Teeter says he's a member.
We're just a group that believes in ultimate personal freedom. As long as you're not hurting anybody else, there's no version of this where the police are not the ones at fault. The protesters have done nothing wrong. They have been attacked and they are responding with violence to violence, which is completely reasonable.
The term Boogaloo comes from a 1984 breakdancing movie, Breakin' 2 Electric Boogaloo, considered all but indistinguishable from the original, much as ardents claim a coming civil war will serve as a repeat of the one that occurred in the 1860s. Often the Boogaloos sport bright colors or Hawaiian shirts. Experts say that goes back to a reference made online to the big luau, which in turn can be code for a civil war. The Washington Post says those with an association to the movement have shown up at 40 George Floyd-related events or protests. Las Vegas police arrested 3 Boogaloos for making Molotov cocktails to allegedly use during protests. But it's important to remember there is no recognized command and control of the Boogaloos, nor is there an agreed-on manifesto. And the lack of organization among them and other groups makes it harder on law enforcement.
There are some groups that don't have a particular ideology other than anarchy. So we are dealing with, as I say, a witch's brew of a lot of different extremist organizations.
You might remember our reporting last night about the Justice Department trying to find a possible command and control structure to who is pre-staging bricks and other weapons. What's missing is the link between any one of those groups and the acts. Shannon, obviously the lack of organization to any of these groups, the Boogaloos in particular, make it all the more difficult.
Yeah, and often part of the strategy. All right, Leland, thank you so much. So, law enforcement under the microscope tonight. Dallas removing a Texas Rangers statue at Love Field over what critics are calling the Rangers' checkered and sometimes tragic history on race. Minneapolis City Council members are looking to disband the police department, calling it irredeemable and ungovernable. Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti wants to cut $150 million from the LAPD budget. So, let's talk about what's happening in Detroit with Police Chief there, James Craig. Chief, good to have you with us tonight, sir.
Always great to be here, Shannon. Thank you.
All right, so many topics to get to, but first of all, tell us the mood there in Detroit, how your folks are doing out there on the streets, and the status of any peaceful protests or otherwise.
You know, the last 2 days have been phenomenal. I mean, compared to what it was probably a week ago, I mean, no violence, all peaceful protests. You know, we imposed a curfew as well. I made a conscious decision last night not to enforce it. The mood was very different than what we saw days prior. We didn't see the violence that you saw in places like LA or New York. And so, but there was some. And certainly, I will tell you, when I look at what we've done in Detroit, the community has lined up, the Detroit community, because as I've reported time and again, there's so many outsiders who have come to Detroit to protest. And Detroiters don't like it. And so they've stood with us, stood by our side. Many times they've walked with these protesters, and most of them are peaceful. But certainly we've had the agitators, as I call them, the professional outside agitators that have really created a problem. But there's a different feel right now for the last 2 days.
I'm glad to hear that. One of the reports there from Click on Detroit says Detroit police officers are working closely with the FBI to identify and track outsiders who are coming to the city and trying to turn protests into chaos. Police have arrested people coming into the city from Washington, D.C., Nashville, and Ohio. Can you tell us anything more about your coordination with the feds to track these outside groups?
Well, I've been having conversations with the supervisory agent in charge, and we've had great conversations, and you know what? We've seen that there's a coordinated effort among these outsiders. I'm talking about specifically to those who are agitating and really the trigger for these violent outbursts. So when I'm looking at what's going on in LA or in Ohio, there's some very similar trends. I think the thing that's very different in Detroit is the fact that we have community members on the ground with us. And that's really made a big difference. We haven't had any looting. We haven't, we certainly the first couple of nights, some officers were attacked with projectiles, boulders, fireworks. We made some arrests. We've certainly been very aggressive in not allowing criminal activity to continue. I certainly think that's played a big role. I remember when I was in Los Angeles following the 1992 or during the 1992 riots, and when the LAPD, and that was a sad day for all of us, when Florence, Normandy, and South Central LA, no police officers. The community felt, where are cops? And so that stuck with me throughout my policing career. And I said, we owe it, we're obligated to continue to provide safety regardless. And I'm not being critical of some of the cities where there's been an absence of police. Who knows what's going on? I know there have been multiple areas in large cities where violence is occurring. But we've been fortunate. We react quickly. We rely heavily on our intelligence, and not just from our federal partners, but also our community partners who are feeding us real-time information, and that's worked very well for us.
Well, Chief, you and your community and your officers must be doing something right. We're glad for the quieter nights in Detroit. Police Chief James Craig, thank you, sir. Always good to see you.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
All right. One Senate committee today authorizing a slew of subpoenas aimed at the origins of the Russia investigation. You'll recognize the names on the list. Now, what could it mean for the upcoming presidential election? We'll tell you next.